This is Sheila Bender, and you are listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today we are talking with Katha Pollitt, who is in Connecticut. Katha Pollitt has been contributing to The Nation magazine since 1980. In her career, she has won many awards, two of them the National Magazine Award, one for essays and criticism, and one for columns and commentary. She's also won a Whiting Foundation Writing Award, the American Sociological Association Award for Excellence in the Reporting of Social Issues, and a Puffin Foundation Writing Fellowship at the Nation Institute. She has won a Maggie Award from Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Many of Pollitt's contributions to the Nation are compiled in 3 books: Reasonable Creatures, Essays on Women and Feminism, Subject to Debate, Sense and Dissents on Women, Politics and Culture, and Virginity or Death, and Other Social and Political Issues of Our Time. In 2007, Random House published her collection of personal essays, Learning to Drive and Other Life Stories. 2 pieces from this book, Learning to Drive and its follow-up, Web Stalker, originally appeared in The New Yorker. Learning to Drive is anthologized in Best American Essays 2003 and has been made into a movie of the same title, starring Patricia Clarkson and Ben Kingsley. Her most recent book is Pro, Reclaiming American Abortion Rights, which the New York Times listed as a notable book of 2014. For her poetry, Pollitt has received a National Endowment for the Arts grant and a Guggenheim Fellowship. Her 1982 poetry collection, Antarctic Traveler, won the National Book Critics Circle Award. Her poems have been published in many magazines and are reprinted in many anthologies, most recently, the Oxford Book of American Poetry. Her second collection, The Mind-Body Problem, came out from Random House in 2009. Welcome, Katha.
Hi, Sheila. Thanks for having me on the show.
I'm excited. I have admired your work for so long. When I was writing an early book of mine on writing the personal essay, I was reading your essays in The Nation and dreaming about meeting you. And this is so wonderful to actually be talking to you in person. So knowing that you write on feminist issues and write on issues of the left, I am really wondering how you're feeling today about the world and how writers can work and help in the world as it is today.
Well, how do I feel today? I feel terrible. It couldn't be worse. Trump's victory, which came as more of a surprise than it probably should have, is very hard to take in. And what he's been doing after his election, and here I always have to say, he did get fewer votes. Hillary will probably come out with about 2 million more votes than Trump, and in a normal country, she would be heading for the White House now, but we don't live in a normal country. So since his election, it's not as though he said, now I've got to bind up the wounds of the nation and govern for everybody. He's the people that he's nominating for various high-profile positions are unbelievable racists and super reactionaries. So that's very discouraging, too.
I think many of us were heartened by the cast of Hamilton taking the time and making the statement that they did when Pence was in the audience, which leads me to want to talk about what writers and poets can do to stand up to this slaughter, kidnapping of our institutions as we knew them.
Well, the first thing I want to say about that is I have no answers. I had to write my column in The Nation right after the election, and it was like a double column of gender and the election. I'm sitting there writing as if I know what I'm talking about, and I'm thinking, Katha, this is above all a time when you should just be shutting up and thinking and listening. So I think that that's one thing we all need to do a lot of. We need to really take on board that a lot of people in this country fundamentally disagree with the things we think are important, whether it's women's rights or reproductive rights or equality for everybody of whatever their race or religion is. There are a lot of people who want to build that stupid wall, who want to throw out 11 million undocumented immigrants, who think Muslims should be subject to extreme vetting, quote unquote, whatever that is, who basically think women should just shut up. I think we need to really take that on board. And so I'm really opposed to some of the things that people tend to do in these situations, which is, for example, spell Republican with 3 Ks instead of a C. Oh, Republic, Ku Klux Klan people. Mm-hmm. Or Republican, That's the thing. One friend of mine always does that. Or Republican. I think these are things that we do that just make us, I mean, I don't do them, but the people who do them, I think it gives them an easy sense of superiority, and it does not serve us well. We have to admit that people who profoundly disagree with us also live here and vote here, and we have to seek to persuade them, or at least persuade enough of them to have better ideas and vote differently and act differently. And another thing is a lot of people are, and maybe this is sort of a little more possible than persuading a convinced Trump voter, is all the people who didn't vote. A lot of people just stayed home. Mm-hmm. They were so thoroughly disgusted by both candidates, and that's fine, but you still, at the end of the day, have to be able to take a step. You have to. It's a forced choice. It's a binary choice. Sorry, Jill Stein. Sorry, Gary Johnson. It's a forced choice, and you have to make one. I think that's the responsible thing to do. And a lot of people just sort of sat it out as though, well, whatever happens, it's no skin off my nose. Well, I think we're going to see that actually it is. So getting on to your actual question, which was what can writers do, the first thing I want to say, or I guess I said the first thing. So the second thing I want to say is I think writers, first of all, have to do what every citizen should be doing, which is to be more involved in civic life, to really stretch, to make donations to the organizations you believe in. But what can writers specifically do as writers? I would say, write. You've got to write. Write letters to the newspaper. Write things that get published in social media and online. Just really try to be involved in what's going on now. And I would say another thing we need is very serious scholarly work, that those of you out there who are scholars can really help us understand how we got here, because I think a lot of people are completely mystified by it. For example, what is populism? Populism is this word people toss around all the time as though all it meant was helping working-class people. That's not what it means. Populism has a very specific history, which is not very edifying. And I think it would be good to spend a little time just really finding out what's going on. Another thing I think is very important and that writers can do a very good job on is really resisting the rising tide of nonsense. There's been a list published of all the fake news sites that many people seem to take as real, which I believe even included The Onion. I mean, can you imagine reading a story in The Onion and thinking it's true? But apparently people did. And I think it's really important for people to be very careful about facts, about not believing things because it makes you feel better or it justifies your worldview or makes you feel special, that you're in the know. I mean, there are a lot of truthers out there. There are birthers who think that President Obama is not really a citizen and is a secret Muslim and was born in Kenya. And there are 9/11 truthers who think that 9/11 is all a setup. And there's Sandy Hook truthers who think that those children weren't really murdered in Connecticut a few years ago by that crazy kid with a gun. And there are people who think the elections were, quote, rigged, unquote, either way. I think it's really important not to fall into that paranoid mindset, which both left and right, I think, do indulge in. And writers, actually their business is care with language, using words accurately, resisting false analogies, I think can be very helpful there.
Thank you. You've given us a big, big assignment, and I hope that the writers listening to the program take it on. I know many of us have, but there's never enough. So thank you. And one of the things I think you mentioned is about listening and not jumping to conclusions, but really listening. And I think that as a poet, you practice that skill, I'm sure, quite a bit. And it's a listening to the core of us, to our hearts. And I'm hoping that we can hear some of your poetry and talk about it a little.
I happen to have here, right here, several copies of my last book of poems, The Mind-Body Problem. One thing I think we could talk a little bit about is the idea of political poetry.
Okay.
There are people who say, well, all writing is political because it's placed in history, it's placed in its moment, it takes some side or the other side. in an unconscious way. And even when you think you're not being political, of course you are, because you have the luxury of ignoring more overt political issues. So I'm of two minds about that. Some things are certainly more political than others. Some things are more topical than others. I would like to make that distinction, that topical poetry, which deals with the issues of the exact moment, I think often has a pretty short shelf life. So I don't write a lot of topical poems, but I do write poems that have a subtext that is feminism, that is skeptical of religious authority, which is another huge thing we're going to be hearing a lot more about. So I'm going to read one of the few poems I've written that is overtly political. And I wrote it in the run-up to the war in Iraq. And you remember there was a huge outpouring of poetry that was organized by Sam Hamill online, probably some other people too whose names I'm forgetting, and eventually an anthology was published by Nation Book of these poems. Anyway, hundreds of thousands of poems. You could paper Versailles with all the poems that were published. And it was very successful because the war didn't take place. Not. Here's my poem, my contribution to that effort, which is called Trying to Write a Poem Against the War. My daughter, who's as beautiful as the day, hates politics. Face it, Ma, they don't care what you think. All passion, like Achilles, she stalks off to her room to confide in her purple guitar and await life's embassies. She's right, of course. Bombs will be hurled at ordinary streets, and leaders look grave for the cameras. And what good are more poems against war, the real subject of which so often seems to be the poet's superior moral sensitivities? I could be mailing myself to the moon or marrying a pine tree, and yet what can we do but offer what we have? And so I spend this cold, gray, milky morning trying to write a poem against war that perhaps may please my daughter, who hates politics and does not care much for poetry either.
Thank you, Katha. Her purple guitar is a
Her purple guitar, she did have a purple
Yes,
guitar.
it's a standout image for me of the ways in which we comfort ourselves, really, with what we can do in our moments. The trying, it's so wonderful to write a poem about trying. It leads me to believe that those of us listening to you today might start a piece of work called Trying to trying to catch that moment where we're trying to find what it is we have in us to speak up. Thank you.
But doesn't Yoda say in one of the Star Wars movies, there is no try?
Yeah, that's true too. It's only doing, not trying. And yet we have to tease it out of ourselves sometimes.
I think Yoda is actually wrong. I mean, unless you're on a quest on a far distant planet.
Yeah.
I think trying is very important, and most of us have, I think, more in us than we know.
Right.
Hope is also important.
And by documenting the trying, you're actually doing. So that was wonderful to hear. Thank you. Did you say you had a couple? So you have another one?
Yeah, well, I want to read another one that is a little more optimistic. The book has a section of poems that are drawn from episodes in the Bible. The Bible is a very interesting book, as you know, with lots of stories that can be told in many, many different ways that lend themselves to many different interpretations, although the evangelical fundamentalists among us would deny that and say there's only one way to look at them. So this is the first one of those poems, and it's about Adam and Eve, and it's called The Expulsion, and it's about them leaving the garden. Adam was happy. Now he had someone to blame for everything. Shipwrecks, Troy, the grave face in the mirror. Eve was happy. Now he would always need her. She walked on boldly, swaying her beautiful hips. The serpent admired his emerald coat. The angel burst into flames. He'd never approved of them, and he was right. Even God was secretly pleased. Let history begin. The dog had no regrets, trotting by Adam's side self-importantly, glad to be rid of the lion, the toad, the basilisk, the white-footed mouse, who were also happy and forgot their names immediately. Only the tree of knowledge stood forlorn, its small, hard, bitter crab apples glinting high up in a twilight of black leaves. How pleasant it had been, how unexpected to have been, however briefly, the center of attention.
You are listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life with Sheila Bender on KPTZ 91.9 FM, Port Townsend. Today, Sheila is interviewing Katha Pollitt, award-winning poet, personal essayist, and longtime political columnist for The Nation magazine.
That poem, if I can just expand on it a little tiny bit, Milton, at the end of Paradise Lost, says, where they're being kicked out of Eden, they've been very bad. Milton says, the world was all before them where to choose. And Milton is saying, okay, now history is beginning. They're kicked out of the garden, and yeah, okay, it's terrible, and Jesus will have to come back, and all that. But this is pretty exciting. They're going to make their own life. So I wanted to convey a little bit of that sense of optimism that now they have to be grown-ups, Adam and Eve, before they were children. Even God wants history, because how boring is it to sit up there in the clouds, right, watching two people in a garden? So that was part of it. I wanted to give a little bit of a sense of hope.
Yes.
And that's where we are now. I think in some ways we've really been kicked out of the garden. Not that it was ever much of a garden to begin with. I think we're facing a new, very complicated, pretty terrible reality, and that will call forth a lot of energy that we didn't know was there.
Just to use the word energy a little bit differently, I'm so impressed by your ability to write commentary, essays, and poetry, and the poetry has some of the same subtext as what your life concerns have been and what you're telling us about today. But I'm wondering, how do you know it's going to be a poem that you're writing as opposed to a column that you know you're writing?
My column has a deadline. I write it every other week. I get paid for that. That's how I live. Most poets live by teaching, but I live by writing for The Nation magazine. The great thing about any kind of deadline is it takes all the anxiety off, or a lot of the anxiety off the work, and it puts it on finishing and turning it in and the mechanics of it. My column has to be a certain length because it fits on a page. So that the fact that it's a job makes it easier to do, because I can say, okay, I'm going to write this column, I'm going to turn it in a little bit past the deadline, but in time. I'm not very good with my deadline. Maybe it's not going to be the best column I've ever written. In fact, I often think, oh, terrible. You just have to do the best job in the amount of time you have. A poem is completely different because nobody is waiting for it. You can spend a year on your poem, and I have definitely done that. Or you can spend a half an hour, whatever. But it's a very different relationship to writing than something you're writing for immediate publication. And I sometimes wish, I wish somebody would give me a poetry column where every 2 weeks I had to turn in a poem. And I would probably write a lot more, because you fall into this habit, at least I have, of writing for immediate publication, writing for the audience you know you have. I mean, I feel like I know my readers at The Nation very well, maybe too well. It's like a family, all the pros and cons of that. Mm-hmm. And the personal essays is a different thing also, where I wrote the first two very quickly at a state of high emotion. And I feel I really kind of hit the nail on the head for me about what I was trying to achieve. Then I said, I can write more of these. I'll get a book contract. And I did. Then I had to write more of them. And then immediately it got much harder.
So you've answered your own question about deadlines and poetry.
Yeah, it got a lot harder. I think there's a belief that writers need endless amounts of time, undisturbed time. They need to be left alone to marinate in themselves. And I don't think that is necessarily the most productive way to work. I think maybe it's a little more productive to have more deadlines, have more of a relationship with readers and the public, more external demands placed upon you, more occasions to rise to.
Wow. Well, we'll have to think about that, because that is a very wonderful way to say that, more occasions to rise to. I think poets do, especially, but all people writing from personal experience that I know have trouble rising to that occasion. They worry about what their most vulnerable things to say, what it'll be like to have those out in the world.
I think with personal essays, that's often a big problem. You know, two of the essays in the book are about my parents. And I should say that the first essay, Learning to Drive, is about the end of a long relationship, and it was pretty mean to my former partner. And the second one was on the same subject. I was really in a very high emotional state, and I didn't care. I didn't care at all if anybody's feelings were hurt. That probably would have made me feel happy. But when I came to writing about my parents, it was quite different, because I loved my parents very much, and they had faults and problems and, in some ways, tragic lives. I don't want to say the worst, most embarrassing thing that I associate with my mother's alcoholism, for instance. I don't want her to go down in a book like that. I think you can convey a lot without saying the worst, without being Mommy Dearest, writing Mommy Dearest. Not that my mother was anything like Joan Crawford. My mother was a wonderful person who happened to have a very serious alcohol problem. I think that there are ways of writing about painful subjects that you'll be able to live with as time goes by. And another thing, I think, Sharon Olds said something really interesting to me about writing. She said, I just write it. I don't censor myself when I write. And if you've read her poems, you can tell that has to be true. But she said, I have a folder of poems that's called 100 Years, which is, this poem can only be published in 100 years because of the incendiary or disturbing or private nature of the poem. So I would say what I take from that is that you write the poem, you write the story, you write the personal essay, and then you can decide whether to publish it. The trick, I think, of all writing is somehow, even though you have to write, it's good if you can write thinking of the reader, thinking of an audience, and not that you're on Mars and writing in moon dust that no one will ever see. I think the other side of it is to not write with a censor or a critic over your head, watching and saying, don't say that. That's the wrong word. Oh, what, you're going there? What a stupid analogy. What we all do when we write, or at least what I do. And I think here, probably the fact that I've been a literary critic, and many writers are also write criticism or write book reviews, I think it doesn't always help to have that eye, to have that ear, to be so attuned to criticism, because then you start to apply it to your own work.
Right.
Too soon. You have to apply it, but maybe not in the first draft, not in the second draft, maybe not even in the third draft.
I think these lessons are really, really important lessons for writers. I love the idea of a folder for things to be published later. You can always switch folders if you decide one, pluck one out,
and put it. Published a lot of those poems by now.
That's a wonderful.
To me a long time ago.
I like that tool a lot, and your words of wisdom, they ring true for me, and I hope that's edifying for a lot of the writers listening. I also think that you have done, obviously, an outstanding job of being outspoken and making people concentrate on issues, really concentrate on them. So it leads me to think, especially in this day of internet trolls, that you might have faced some difficult situations because of your topics and what you write about. And I'm wondering if you have, and if there has been anything also very gratifying about your place in the literary world.
I guess the thing I wrote that was the most controversial was after 9/11, I wrote a column. If I didn't have that deadline, I probably would have phrased a little more carefully, but nonetheless expressed what I basically believe. And it was against flying the flag. And it was about how my daughter wanted to fly the flag out our living room window. And I said, no, you can fly the flag out your bedroom, but I don't want a flag here. Once people start with the flag, it's jingoism and war. That's what happens next. And I was right about that. So I wrote a column in which I said this, and I said, I wish there was some other symbol that we could use after 9/11, something more universal, something more international, because this isn't just America against the world. This is a deeper problem. I got a tremendous amount of pushback, to put it politely, from that. I was on page 6 of the New York Post, which is their sort of evil gossip page, all about how terrible I was. Some conservatives associated, I think it was with the Weekly Standard, suggested everyone send flags to my daughter since her mother was too evil to fly a flag. And what was really funny about that was my daughter did receive quite a bit of mail, but she only received one actual flag. She got these, you know how, like, cocktail decorations that are like a toothpick with a little flag on it.
She got a lot of those.
She got some of those. People drew flags, people wrote her letters, and one person sent her $5 and said, buy your mother some red, white, and blue flowers. I thought that was very sweet. She didn't do that, though. I got a lot of attacks for that, and it was around the same time that Susan Sontag was saying things about 9/11, some other writers, and so we were all sort of lumped together.
It sounds like you faced those difficulties with a great amount of humor.
Oh, yeah, I did. I would say that as writers in controversial areas go, I've gotten off very lightly. For example, my Reclaiming Abortion Rights, when I gave a public reading in Texas at the Texas Book Fair when it came out, and they had marshals in the audience in case there were outraged anti-abortion people or even violent anti-abortion people. And instead what happened is it turned into this revival meeting where women were standing up and talking about their abortions and vowing their loyalty
that
to
must have
Planned
been
Parenthood and all like this. It was quite an exhilarating occasion. So I would say that for one reason or another, I have really gotten off very lightly, and I have no idea if that will continue. One thing, you mentioned internet trolls, and it's really interesting because I don't hear much from them. And I think the reason is that I'm not on social media as much as some other people are, and I don't write in the places that internet trolls troll for so much. But also I think there's something, this is just my theory, I think I'm too old to attract them. I think they really go after the young, pretty women. They attack women much more than men, and they attack them in a very sexual way, and using all the horrible four-letter words that you can find on a pro-Trump T-shirt. And I think I'm just not in their emotional purview.
Well, I'm taking a deep breath when I listen to that, but mostly I'm remembering the image of the women at your reading, standing up and claiming their rights and their experience with abortion. We're going to have to end soon, although I would love to talk to you for hours. I feel very inspired hearing from you, and I would like to know if you'd like to tell people where they can find some of your work online.
Oh, well, my column at The Nation is always there. You might have to scroll down till you find my name. I'm a columnist there. So then you can just read a whole bunch of them. Book, The Mind-Body Problem, is unfortunately out of print in America, but it's available from Seren Books, which is a UK publisher, so you can get that online. And there are some poems of mine at poets.org. Is that the one?
Yeah, Poetry Foundation?
Yeah, the Poetry Foundation website, although those tend to be earlier poems. My book, Learning to Drive, exists in many, many copies that you can find at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Powell's and everywhere, in the beautiful movie tie-in cover, which has Patricia Clarkson and Ben Kingsley on the cover. All my books, except for The Mind-Body Problem and my other book of poems, Antarctic Traveler, are in print.
Fabulous.
And available.
Thank you.
Everywhere.
Thank you so much. Appreciate our talk today very, very much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Sheila. It was really fun. It cheered me up, too.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman.